Tonight, the first topic we discover is the life of Catherine the Terrific, the German-born princess who converted herself into Russia's maximum powerful and arguable empress. From orchestrating a coup towards her personal husband to embracing Enlightenment philosophy whilst ruling with an iron fist, Catherine's tale is certainly one of sharp intellect, endless ambition, scandalous affairs, and sweeping reforms. So, before you get too secure, as continually, take a moment to like the video and enroll in the channel, however simplest if you experience our content. Additionally, let us know in which you're watching from and what time it's far for you. Every so often our stories are too interesting, and we're working on a few uninteresting ones, we promise. It's time now to dim the lighting fixtures, activate a fan for a few heritage noise, and permits cover what we've for this night together. She changed into born Sophie Frederica Osta von Anhalt-Dornberg on May additionally 2d 1729 in a quiet nook of the Holy Roman Empire. Her family was noble, sure, however handiest just. They have been minor German aristocrats, nicely linked however not effective, living in modest comfort, no longer in grandeur. Her father was a Prussian officer. Her mother became bold and sharp-tongued, dreaming of raising the own family's popularity through clever marriage alliances. Sophie, even as a baby, sensed this hunger for social mountain climbing, sensed it, and in time could wield it like a weapon. She wasn't born to rule. No one in Germany whispered her call with future. Yet she becomes shiny, intellectually curious, unusually poised and obsessed on mastering. She absorbed languages easily, devoured books, and watched courtroom conduct with hawk-like focus. Her international becomes small, but her mind become already wandering a ways beyond the bloodless halls of Zurst. While she became 14, the unexpected took place. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who had no children of her personal, had chosen a successor. Her nephew, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, some other German-born noble. However, Peter wished a bride, and Elizabeth desired one that can be easily molded. Sophie became decided on. Overnight, her world shifted. Russia was now not simply every other country. It turned into an empire, great and atypical, and it'd soon turn out to be her domestic. The adventure was long and bloodless. Sophie arrived in Russia as a foreigner with little Russian, no orthodox religion, and only a name that tied her to her former lifestyles. However, she didn't hesitate. She converted to Orthodoxy, taking the call Catherine Alexeyeva. She studied Russian day and night until she should communicate it better than Peter. She adapted, reshaped herself, erased any hint of resistance. Her mother known as her too serious. Courtiers known as her too quiet. But Catherine became reading everyone, especially her future husband. She saw in Peter a boy trapped in a person's frame, infantile and awkward, greater enamored with his army dolls than with international relations or love. And in that bloodless consciousness, Catherine made her first quiet vow. If Peter may want to inherit a throne, she may want to scouse borrow one. She had arrived as a pawn in someone else's recreation. However, already the pieces have been transferring, and Catherine intended to emerge as queen. The royal wedding became the whole lot it needed to be. Grand, symbolic, politically beneficial. But for Catherine, it turned into also the start of a long, icy iciness. Her husband Peter changed into no prince captivating. Immature, awkward, and emotionally stunted, Peter confirmed little hobby in his bride. He spent extra time marching toy infantrymen across tabletops, than attractive within the affairs of court docket or the heart. At times he seemed extra like a child playing emperor than a person destined to rule one of the global's largest empires. Catherine but performed her component with quiet precision. She smiled on the proper moments. She dressed with beauty. She discovered the whole thing, mainly what no longer to end up. She quickly found out that if she turned into to survive in the Russian courtroom, she needed to rely upon her wits, no longer her marriage. And so she began to build a lifestyle of the thoughts. She studied compulsively, hiding books under her pillows and staying up through the night. Records, philosophy, the writings of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire became her mystery teachers. She wrote letters, kept journals, and started to shape a non-public vision of what a ruler may be. Someone who used power not for cruelty or indulgence, however for development, justice, and reform. In a palace that whispered with intrigue, Catherine turned into quietly becoming risky. But threat labored each approaches. The court turned into treacherous. Spies lingered in hallways. Alliances shifted overnight. Even Catherine's fitness faltered. Rumors swirled that Peter resented her so deeply. He withheld remedy throughout a near-deadly contamination. She recovered, but she in no way forgot. And so Catherine started out cultivating her own allies, a few key nobles, army guys, even her personal physician. She discovered which phrases to say, which to withhold, and which to whisper at the back of closed doors. And whilst her marriage turned bloodless, she became to others for affection. Fanatics entered her life discreetly for now, and with them got here affect, protection, and on occasion love. However, love was now not her goal. Power become. Peter changed into nonetheless the heir. But Catherine turned into now not content material to be his shadow. She had tasted the politics of survival, the fun of analyzing forbidden texts, and the candy clarity of ambition. She might not just be empress by title, she would be empress by means of will. Whilst Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter III ascended the throne. Catherine, now in her early 30s, had waited over a decade inside the shadows, studying, learning, preparing. However, the guy she married remained as erratic and unpopular as ever. In only some quick months, Peter managed to alienate the Russian Orthodox Church, insult the nobility, and withdraw troops from a positive conflict against Prussia, his place of birth's ally, however Russia's enemy. His loyalty to Frederick the Extraordinary disgusted the navy. His mocking of Russian traditions infuriated the courtroom. And Catherine, she watched it all with silent precision. She had already begun nurturing a quiet community of loyalists. Men like Gregory Olaf, a speeding military officer, and her lover who had near ties to the imperial defend. Olaf wasn't only a romantic accomplice. He changed into her key to strength. In the back of palace partitions, Catherine whispered her plans. She made promises, and she secured oaths. She had no criminal declare to the throne, but she had something far more potent: the self-assurance of folks who held swords. Then came the moment. At the morning of June 28th, 1762, with Peter distracted and unaware, Catherine made her move. She rode to the Ismailsky regiment barracks, stood earlier than the infantrymen, and declared herself sovereign of Russia. They pledged loyalty instant. Separately, the guards, the nobles, and even the clergy accompanied. She rode via St. Petersburg in full regalia, calm and commanding. The human beings did not upward push against her. They welcomed her. Peter fled. Days later, he became pressured to abdicate. And soon after, he became useless. Murdered under suspicious occasions, likely by using Catherine's allies. She by no means admitted to ordering it. She never denied profiting from it. While asked about his loss of life, she virtually stated he was now not needed. It had been a nearly cold coup. No mass uprisings, no civil war, just a flawlessly completed pivot of strength from one ruler to some other. Catherine had done the unthinkable. A foreign-born lady had seized the Russian throne without her, without majority assist, and without worry. Her rule become now authentic. But now got here the more difficult part: proving she deserved it. She had claimed the crown. Now she should earn it. Catherine understood something few rulers of her time did: that electricity wasn't pretty much army control or royal blood. It became about photograph. And so once the crown turned into hers, she did not rest. She transformed. From a coup-born ruler, she recast herself as a reformer, a student of enlightenment, a sovereign with imaginative and prescient. She styled herself as a truth-seeker on the throne, replacing letters with Voltaire, Darrow, and other excellent thinkers of Europe. To them, she wasn't only a monarch. She was proof that ideas could form empires. She invited philosophers to courtroom, dispatched money to scholars, publicly praised liberty, schooling, and motive, all while ruling with unequaled authority. However, thoughts failed to constantly suit well into Russian truth. Russia became nevertheless a deeply feudal society. The aristocracy held land and peasants. Serfdom chained millions in poverty. Catherine desired to reform it. She dreamed of modernizing the legal device, improving schools, cleaning the forms of corruption. In 1767, she convened a fee to draft a new criminal code, one that would be truthful, rational, and humane. She, in my opinion, wrote the NACAs, or training, a bold Enlightenment-stimulated document that criticized torture, recommended for training, and emphasized equality before the regulation. EU thinkers hailed it as visionary. But at home, the commission failed. The nobles were not interested in giving up their privileges. The clergy-driven returned toward secular thoughts. And Catherine, ever the realist, returned. She might now not spark civil warfare in the name of idealism. She shelved many reforms. However, she never abandoned the image of reform. Nonetheless, a few changes did take root. She multiplied schooling, especially for girls. She based the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, Russia's first country-funded school for girls. She poured resources into the arts, starting theaters, libraries, and museums. Below her reign, St. Petersburg became a middle of subculture and beauty. She was building a Russian enlightenment, now not by pressure, however by way of thought. But her enlightenment became a delicate dance. She had to preserve the nobles dependable, the peasants quiet, and the philosophers impressed. She walked a tight rope between progress and protection, between beliefs and energy. Catherine spoke the language of liberty. However, she dominated with the subject of a monarch, and in the back of each public ideal become a very calculated method. For all her intellect and subject, Catherine ought to never escape one issue: people's obsession together with her non-public life. In the glittering halls of the Russian court, where whispers traveled quicker than reality, the Empress's fanatics have become legends. Her first extremely good affair after the coup were with Grigory Orlov, the soldier who helped bring her to power. Courageous, dependable, and good-looking, Orlov turned into more than a romantic companion. He was her co-conspirator. Collectively, that they had reshaped the destiny of the Russian Empire. But as the years exceeded, their bond started out to fade. Orlov's conduct turned erratic, and Catherine, ever rational, started out to look somewhere else. What observed changed into a protracted collection of liaisons, each one cautiously chosen. These had been not reckless flings. Catherine's fanatics have been often men of expertise, intelligence, or army fee. They were part of her political ecosystem. A few were talented directors. Others were generals. And one Gregory P.M.P.Kin would emerge as the maximum sizable. P.M.P.Kin became no normal courtroom favored. He changed into remarkable, passionate, and formidable. Their love burned intensely, and even though it didn't last romantically all the time, their political partnership continued for lifestyles. P.M.P.Kin helped Catherine comfortable Crimea, extend Russia's borders, and shape foreign policy. They may have even secretly married, although no evidence became ever found. However, even after they drifted romantically, they wrote to each different constantly, heat, witty, and often intimate letters that revealed mutual admiration. Nevertheless, the courtroom and the continent gossiped. Overseas ambassadors suggested breathlessly on her lengthy listing of fanatics. Pamphlets in Europe painted her as immoral, debauched, even dangerous. One grotesque rumor, completely fake, claimed she died attempting to be intimate with a horse. It changed into pure slander, weaponized misogyny, supposed to punish a female for ruling with energy and sensuality. Catherine in no way replied to those attacks without delay. She didn't need to. Her rule spoke louder than any whisper. She had taken and held the Russian throne. She expanded its territory, reformed its institutions, and ruled with unequaled performance. Sure, she loved fiercely, however never foolishly. Her affairs may additionally have taken aback the antique world, but to Catherine, love turned into simply any other area of politics, a place wherein loyalty changed into earned, passion became useful, and hearts might be as strategic as armies. Catherine spoke frequently of liberty, of justice, of enlightenment. However, at the back of the silks and salons, at the back of the witty letters to Voltaire and the progressive speeches, changed into a ruler who understood the necessity of energy and the charge of preserving it. In 1773, simply over a decade into her reign, Russia erupted. A person named Yamlan Pugachev, a Cossack and previous soldier, claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's long-dead husband. He, known as her a usurper, promised land to the peasants, freedom to the serfs. He lit a flame that spread speedy through the nation-state, where struggling and resentment had lengthy been simmering. It have become the Pugachev Rebellion, the most important peasant uprising in Russian records. Catherine Shaken spoke back without mercy. Troops had been dispatched. Villagers burned. Rebels were captured, tortured, and hanged. Pugachev himself changed into paraded via Moscow in a cage before being executed. And with his loss of life, Catherine dispatched a clean message. Assignment the throne and you will suffer. It became a turning factor. The empress who had once championed the rights of the humans now dominated with a ways less idealism. She had seen what chaos appeared like, and it terrified her. The riot had exposed the deep fractures of her empire, the poverty, the inequality, the desperation. However, in preference to addressing the one's wounds via reform, she tightened her grip. Serfdom accelerated below her rule. Noble privileges were bolstered. The significant rural terrible fell deeper into bondage. To keep peace, Catherine sided with the aristocracy because they held the key to her survival. But the contradiction haunted her reign. To Europe she becomes still the enlightened monarch, the modernizer, the purchaser of the arts and sciences. However, at domestic, she had grown to be something sterner, extra-imperial, much less idealistic. The woman who as soon as dreamed of rewriting Russia's laws now issued decrees that reinforced the popularity quo. However, perhaps that became her genius. Catherine had discovered what many idealists by no means do. That to keep electricity in a turbulent international, you from time to time should betray the very thoughts that brought you there. She wore philosophy like a crown, but underneath it was iron. If Catherine ruled Russia with imaginative and prescient, she expanded it with precision. Unlike many monarchs who dreamed simplest of securing borders, she dreamed of developing them. Her Russia might no longer simply be a land mass. It would be an empire of affect, subculture, and uncooked geopolitical power. She grew to become her gaze south first to the Black Sea and the weakening Ottoman Empire. Controlling the Crimea's supposed heat-water ports, new alternate routes, and strategic dominance. The wars had been long and high-priced, but Catherine's navy, guided in element with the aid of her depended on advisor, Gregory P.M.P. Kin, was relentless. Via 1783, Crimea was annexed. Russia now had direct access to the Black Sea, and with it, a seat at the desk of maritime powers. Next, she became West. Poland, fractured via internal strife and weakened by using centuries of political infighting, have become her subsequent focus. Catherine placed herself as a protector of Polish stability, while secretly working to divide and triumph over. In 3 degrees, the partitions of Poland, she joined with Austria and Prussia to carve up the United States of America. Via the very last partition in 1795, Poland, as an unbiased nation, had vanished. A once proud nation was now divided, and much of its Jap territory belonged to Catherine. It became brutal diplomacy, cold, calculated, powerful. Underneath her reign, Russia's borders improved with the aid of greater than 200,000 square miles. Hundreds of thousands of recent topics have been added. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Tatars, Jews. The Russian Empire had in no way been large, nor greater various. But growth got here with fee. The brand new territories had been tough to control. Some resisted Russian manage, others demanded autonomy. The empire grew heavier and harder to preserve. Catherine responded with reforms, reorganizing provinces, putting in new schools, and attempting to standardize administration. It turned into a bureaucratic race in opposition to unrest. Yet through it all, Catherine remained composed. She offered her conquests now not as imperial aggression, but as civilizations develop. She wrote to EU leaders as though she had been spreading Enlightenment beliefs, no longer swallowing international locations. To her allies, she became a stateswoman. To her enemies, an imperial predator. But to history, she became something greater, uncommon. A ruler who multiplied an empire, no longer via reckless struggle, but through cunning method and diplomatic beauty. With each annexation, her Russia grew now not simply in size, however in ambition. As Catherine elderly, the fire in her mind in no way dimmed, but her frame started to gradual. She remained fiercely energetic in authorities, studying reviews, drafting reforms, and attending court docket features nicely into her 60s. However, the global round her turned into changing and rapid. Throughout Europe, revolution changed into within the air. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, sending surprise waves through each royal court. Kings were beheaded. Crowds demanded liberty and equality. For an empress who once embraced Enlightenment beliefs, the rebellion became deeply unsettling. Catherine, once a friend to philosophers, now noticed their words as risky sparks. She banned French progressive texts, She tightened censorship. Her court docket, as soon as open to ideas, became suspicious and guarded. Her enlightenment, it regarded, had an expiration date. She additionally grew more isolated. The affection of her existence, P.M. Pekin, passed away in 1791. Their dating had lengthy shifted from romantic to political. However, his death struck her deeply. She continued to rely upon more youthful favorites, guys who had been charming and constant, however rarely matched the strategic brilliance of her earlier partners. And then there has been her son, Paul. Catherine distrusted him. She saw in Paul none of her intelligence, none of her balance. He became emotional, impulsive, and drawn to autocratic ideals that clashed along with her greater balanced fashion. Privately, she'd taken into consideration bypassing him altogether, grooming her grandson Alexander as the subsequent Tsar. It became a bold plan, one she never had time to complete. In November of 1796, Catherine suffered a huge stroke. She in no way regained cognizance. She died days later on my own in her chambers, with unfinished reforms on her table and unstated thoughts in her journals. While Paul took the throne, his first act became to undo lots of his mom's rules. He buried her in Peter's mausoleum, next to the husband she had overthrown, and who may also have died via her command. In loss of life, they have been united in stone, even though in no way in lifestyles. The court mourned her. The U.S. paused and Europe watched the passing of one, in all its most fascinating monarchs. Catherine the Terrific had reigned for 34 years. She left behind a larger, more powerful Russia and a legacy that also sparks debate centuries later. But her very last bankruptcy changed into written in silence. Catherine the Wonderful become, in no way speculated to rule. She wasn't Russian by means of beginning. She wasn't born into a throne. And but via intelligence, political mastery, and ruthless willpower, she have become one of the longest reigning monarchs in Russian records. Her legacy is complicated, complete of contradictions that records continues to resolve. She spoke the language of enlightenment. She wrote about justice, cause, and reform. She engaged with the best minds of her age and attempted to carry their beliefs into one of the most autocratic empires inside the global. But whilst those ideals threatened her electricity, she suppressed them. She dreamed of liberating the serfs, however elevated serfdom. She stated equality, but dominated with absolute authority. But her impact is undeniable. She modernized Russia's management, making it more efficient, greater centralized, greater successful. She added schools, hospitals, and the arts to cities that had as soon as recognized little more than military parades and church rituals. Underneath her management, Russia became not just bigger, but stronger, wealthier, and greater reputable on the world stage. She dominated in a man's world and beat guys at their personal sport. Her courtroom became packed with effective advisors and fanatics. However, make no mistake, Catherine turned into constantly the one in control. Every courting, every policy, every letter she wrote changed into part of a broader imaginative and prescient. She became St. Petersburg into a beacon of European way of life. She improved the empire's borders past imagination, and she or he left behind libraries, statues, and institutions that carried her name lengthy after her death. But perhaps her finest legacy is not in territory or legislation, however in possibility. Catherine proved that a girl ought to lead an empire, that aura, intellect, and sheer pressure of will may want to increase a minor princess into a world-shaping sovereign. She shattered expectancies, now not with rebellion but with refinement, no longer with noise but with calculation. To a few she stays an image of tyranny, to others the goddess of reason. But to history she is something extra than myth, something actual. A unsuitable, outstanding, relentless individual who dominated for over a long time and left her fingerprints on a whole civilization. Catherine the Amazing failed to simply reign. She rewrote the script for what a ruler any ruler can be. Lengthy earlier than it turned into a city, El Dorado was a man, a king, they stated, included from head to toe in best gold dirt. He stood upon a raft floating within the middle of a sacred lake, surrounded by priests and nobles. As the solar rose, he solid jewels, emeralds, and golden offerings into the water, tributes to the gods. It turned into a rite, a legend, a whisper in the wind. The indigenous Muisca humans of what is now Colombia referred to as him El Hombre Dorado, the Golden Man. However, while the Spanish conquistadors arrived inside the early 1500s, they misunderstood. They heard El Dorado and failed to think about a ritual or a man. They imagined an area, a golden state hidden within the mountains, untouched by way of conflict, glittering with treasure. The transformation turned into quick. Inside the eco-creativeness, El Dorado morphed from a person right into a city, then a nation, then an entire empire. The name failed to simply suggest gold. It supposed paradise, salvation, a place wherein all desires may be fulfilled. And for the Spaniards, starving, determined, thousands of miles from domestic, it changed into impossible to resist. The jungles of South America became alive with the rumor. Somewhere deep in the green unknown, a city of gold waited. The local people spoke cautiously, often trying to appease or misinform their aggressive guests. They stated some distance off lands, odd rivers, and shimmering objects. The conquistadors, hungry for wealth and honor, took each phrase as a clue. El Dorado wasn't only a fable. It became a fever. In campfires and letters again home, the tale grew large. Infantrymen who hadn't even left Spain heard about it. Poets romanticized it. Monarchs funded expeditions for it. It not mattered if it existed. What mattered turned into the notion that it is able to. And perception in the age of conquest was all you wished. This golden phantasm could pressure a few men to greatness and others to insanity. It would end up one of the maximum effective legends, inside the history of exploration. A promise of riches simply out of attain, always deeper in the jungle, always just past the following ridge. El Dorado changed into now not a story. It turned into a compass that pointed to nowhere. And still they observed it. In 1541, a brutal expedition set out from Quito, led by Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the infamous Francisco Pizarro, who had conquered the Inca Empire. Gonzalo had heard the rumors of cinnamon forests, of lands wealthy with gold, and of a golden metropolis known as El Dorado waiting simply past the Andes. He became determined to discover it, regardless of the fee. He introduced with him over 300 Spanish infantrymen, loads of native porters, some dozen horses, and a dream fabricated from gold and desperation. The jungle, but was not a dream. It turned into a dwelling, breathing nightmare. Rain poured for days without stopping. Rivers swelled and swallowed their resources. Insects wolfed pores and skin. Guys collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, and ailment. As the weeks dragged into months, the day trip commenced to crumble. Meals vanished. Morale crumbled. Many of the indigenous porters died or fled. The Spanish, carrying heavy armor and sporting weapons now useless against the jungle, have become vulnerable and paranoid. Gonzalo Pizarro, desperate, ordered a smaller celebration to push ahead on the lookout for food and a manor ahead. That group was led by way of Francisco de Orellana, a lesser-known nobleman who could soon make history by means of twist of fate. Orellana's celebration floated down a river, following its winding cutting edge deeper into unknown territory. Days was weeks, and Orellana realized he couldn't return upstream to rejoin Pizarro. There was most effective one direction left forward. With a handful of guys and a makeshift brigantine, Orellana continued down what would in the future be referred to as the Amazon River. He exceeded through extensive, seemingly countless forests, and encountered indigenous civilizations that regarded far more superior than anticipated. He later claimed to have seen grand towns, well-organized societies, and even tribes of warrior girls, testimonies that might inflame the El Dorado legend for centuries. Sooner or later, Orellana reached the Atlantic Ocean. He became the first EU to navigate the complete length of the Amazon, but he had discovered no gold, no El Dorado, most effective a delusion that now stretched across a continent. Lower back inside the Andes, Gonzalo Pizarro's forces had nearly all died. The survivors crawled lower back to Quito, damaged and starving. But the damage had already been done. The jungle had taken its first real blood for El Dorado, and the parable was just getting started. By using the mid-1500s, the Spanish obsession with El Dorado had shifted from the huge unknown of the jungle to an unmarried haunting area, Lake Guatavita. Nestled within the green highlands of what's now crucial Colombia, this almost flawlessly round crater lake shimmered with eerie splendor. However, it wasn't the view that drew conquistadors. It was the legend. The Moisa folks that lived close by had long done sacred rituals there. One ritual in particular had gripped Eku imaginations. A chieftain bare and dusted in gold, cruising to the center of the lake on a raft, tossing emeralds, gold, and treasured offerings into the water as gifts to the gods. To the Spanish, it wasn't religion. It turned into a vault, and that they were decided to open it. In 1536, Conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Sada was the primary to arrive. His men fished a few golden trinkets from the lake's edge, stirring simply sufficient wish to keep the obsession alive. Over the following couple of decades, more than one tries have been made to extract the meant treasure resting at the lake's backside. In one of the most infamous efforts, in 1580, a rich entrepreneur named Antonio de Zipolva attempted to drain the whole lake. He and his group of indigenous workers dug a massive gash into the mountainside, forming a channel to bleed the water away. As the level dropped, dust and particles surfaced alongside some portions of gold, but the facets collapsed before the lake will be completely drained. The excavation killed many workers, and at the same time as a few golden artifacts had been discovered, the legendary hoard of treasure remained hidden under layers of silt and legend. Still, the attempt had an extraordinary result. The lake itself have become sacred to the parable of El Dorado. It wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It have become the thrashing heart of the tale. An area wherein gold were provided for hundreds of years, wherein secrets and techniques lay buried below the water's surface, and where hope refused to die. Even centuries later, Lake Guatvita might draw treasure hunters armed with sonar, scuba gear, and dynamite. However, the lake remained stubborn. It kept its secrets and techniques close. And like the myth it fueled, it promised everything and brought only echoes. By means of the past due 16th century, a Dorado fever had crossed the Atlantic. Not became it most effective a Spanish pursuit. Now the English, ambitious, rising and eager to challenge Spain's dominance, set their attractions at the golden metropolis. And nobody become more enchanted through the legend than Sir Walter Raleigh. A poet, soldier, and favored of Queen Elizabeth II, Raleigh was ambitious, clever, and complete of theatrical appeal. But he became also fiercely formidable, desperate to carve a legacy that might rival the awesome conquistadors. El Dorado, he believed, changed into not just a myth, it was his destiny. In 1595, sailed to Ghana, the dense unmapped area near the Orinoco River in modern Venezuela. He had read Spanish reviews, heard testimonies from captured natives, and satisfied himself that the town of gold lay someplace inside the rain-sopping wet indoors. His journey was grueling, thick jungles choking heat and uncooperative terrain. But he lower back domestic with an impressive tale. He claimed to have observed a civilization at the verge of discovery, a land wealthy with gold ruled by means of a robust emperor simply beyond attain. His posted account, the discovery of the large, wealthy, and delightful empire of Guana, became packed with indistinct maps and suggestive element. There has been no proof, but Raleigh's words sparkled with sufficient creativeness to captivate England. Queen Elizabeth became intrigued. The public turned into enthralled. Raleigh became a legend. But the years surpassed. Elizabeth died. Raleigh lost his prefer and his freedom. Imprisoned inside the Tower of London under King James I. Yet El Dorado nevertheless burned in his thoughts. In 1617, after years of confinement, he became granted one closing threat, an expedition to Guiana to sooner or later prove his declare. This time all of it fell apart. His guys attacked a Spanish outpost, violating the fragile peace between England and Spain. Worse, Rigby's loved son, Wat, changed into killed inside the skirmish. Defeated, grieving, and empty past, Raleigh back to England. King James was livid. Raleigh became finished in 1618. Beheaded in public, his dreams undone by the very fantasy he as soon as made shine. He had chased a city that could in no way have existed, and in doing so, he became its most tragic explorer. As the centuries turned, El Dorado refused to die. With every failed expedition, the myth handiest grew stronger, like a mirage that shimmered brighter the extra it was chased. The jungle, considerable and uncharted, became both canvas and executioner. Limitless men ventured into its emerald depths, satisfied that gold awaited simply beyond the next ridge, the subsequent river, the next breathless day. They came from everywhere. Portuguese fortune-seekers, German adventurers, Dutch traders, Jesuit missionaries. Every carried memories, weapons, and goals. Few again. Fewer nevertheless lower back sane. The Amazon rainforest, which spans tens of millions of rectangular kilometers, is one of the most unforgiving environments on the earth. Thick canopies blocked out the sun. Rivers modified route without warning. Toxic bugs and lethal snakes blended into the foliage. Starvation claimed a few, disorder claimed others. Folks that managed to push deeper faced even more threats. Indigenous tribes fiercely protective in their lands, whose resistance was speedy, coordinated, and frequently fatal. Over and over, the same sample emerged. A promising lead, a nicely funded day trip. Weeks of warfare and then silence. Many had been in no way visible once more. Still, notion persisted. The myth had evolved. El Dorado became no longer a single metropolis. It became a floating dream. To some, it turned into hidden inside the Andes. To others, deep inside the jungle's belly. Some imagined it in caves, others in lakes. It modified with each explorer's wish. And that is what made it risky. The jungle didn't need traps. It failed to want armies. It most effective wanted time. Guys wandered deeper and deeper, guided by way of desire and misdirection, until exhaustion broke them. A few went mad. Others grew to become on every other. The line among explorer and victim blurred, till it turned into erased absolutely. Even when not anything turned into found, the survivors still stated symptoms. Glimpses of golden idols, distant lights, odd voices echoing at night time. Their minds half-starved, and one too hallucinating became compasses, spinning wildly in all guidelines. El Dorado had turned out to be a mental labyrinth, one that promised paradise but demanded the entirety in return. The jungle didn't protect a city of gold. It guarded a story. And in that story, hope itself had become a trap. For centuries, the myth of El Dorado changed into dismissed as fable, an illusion spun from greed, false impression, and EU conceitedness. However, in current a long time, something high quality has emerged. Proof that maybe, just maybe, El Dorado wasn't absolutely a lie. Now not a metropolis of golden partitions. No. Now not streets paved in treasure. However, symptoms of good-sized superior civilizations that once thrived within the very regions conquistadors called empty. Deep in the Amazon, archaeologists and scientists have uncovered remnants of lost cities, agricultural systems, and vast avenue networks now buried below layers of jungle. In Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, satellite TV for PC imagery and floor surveys have found out the outlines of geometric mounds, moat cities, and problematic irrigation canals. Those were not small tribal encampments. They were prepared societies, some in all likelihood home to tens of lots of people. And then there is the soil. In scattered parts of the Amazon, researchers observed terrapater, dark earth, enriched with charcoal, bones, and compost. It is no longer herbal. It become engineered, created by means of ancient Amazonians to make terrible soil fertile. It suggests an extended-term sustainable civilization that understood its environment a long way higher than as soon as believed. May want to or not, it's that when early explorers spoke of great towns inside the jungle, they had been seeing the closing sparkles of a dying international, a civilization ravaged by European disease before it could be completely understood. A few agree with so. Even Francisco de Orellana, whose Amazon adventure turned into lengthy considered exaggerated, is now being reassessed. His claims of bustling towns and powerful tribes were dismissed for centuries. But new findings endorse he may have been telling the truth, just a version of it Europe wasn't equipped to trust. So perhaps El Dorado was never one golden town, but the reflection of many real ones, a patchwork of thriving cultures that dazzled the eyes of outsiders best to vanish underneath jungle and time. The legend then turned into now not built from nothing. It changed into constructed from fragments, misunderstood and reshaped via conquest. The gold can also have been symbolic, the grandeur exaggerated, but the roots of the tale have been continually real. El Dorado might not have been a place on a map, but it may have been a memory. As the parable of El Dorado unfolded through Europe, it didn't simply live in songs or whispered memories. It became etched into maps. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, map makers, Cartographers working from stories rather than science began to fill the blank areas of South the USA with invention. The unknown became terrifying, but it became also a blank canvas. And nothing stuffed that canvas higher than gold. Across vintage parchment maps, the word El Dorado seems in bold script pinned to lakes, rivers, and mountains that by no means existed. Sometimes the city becomes shown as nestled near Lake Guatavita. Other times it floated deep inside the Amazon or hidden behind the Orinoco. A few maps blanketed complete golden empires, complete with drawn homes, sun temples, and fantastical creatures guarding the manor. Those maps weren't attracted to lie to. No longer precisely. They were interested in sell. Everyone become a siren track to monarchs, traders, and mercenaries. They sparked funding for expeditions. They justified claims over overseas lands. They presented explorers something simply real enough to chase. The absence of proof was the point. The less certain the location, the extra creativeness it allowed. And so the parable grew, now not just in stories but in geography. Some of those maps observed their way into royal courts. Others have been published in books handed from hand at hand, with the aid of those dreaming of wealth and wonder. They had been copied, plagiarized, decorated, and each new edition introduced extra detail, extra reality, greater attraction. Those fake geography had real consequences. Expeditions had been released based totally on them. Lives have been misplaced pursuing the curves of rivers that didn't exist. Complete regions had been colonized primarily based on legends scribbled with the aid of guys who had never stepped foot out of doors Europe. But the maximum charming component, some of these maps persevered to flow into after El Dorado were discredited. Why? Because human beings don't allow passive wish without difficulty. A map is more than a device. It is a promise. And those guarantees glittered. Even these days, the one's antique maps are well-liked collector's items. Not because they are correct, but due to the fact they captured a moment while belief changed into more potent than evidence. El Dorado never needed to be real. It simply needed to be drawn. Centuries have exceeded. The jungle has swallowed up the bones, the rusted swords, and the silent footprints of individuals who chased El Dorado. And nevertheless, the myth survives. It lives in books, movies, and museum reveals. In the animated stories, we display our youngsters, and the documentaries we movement overdue into the night time. It's Indiana Jones and the road to El Dorado. It is a image now. Extra than a town, more than a man. It is in concept. Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers nonetheless returned to South the USA, armed now with compasses, rifles, and scientific curiosity. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the maximum reputable scientists of his time, ventured through South the US in the early 1800s. Even though skeptical, even he turned into drawn to the testimonies. He searched now not for gold, but for fact, and found the jungle nevertheless whispered of hidden civilizations. Later came Percy Fawcett, the British explorer whose obsession with a misplaced Amazonian metropolis, he known as its Zed, mirrored the antique desires of El Dorado. In 1925, he vanished into the jungle along with his son, by no means to return. Some say he died on the hands of a tribe. Others accept as true with he observed something and selected to stay hidden. And even inside the 21st century, the quest hasn't ended. Armed with satellite TV for PC imagery, drones, and LAR technology, archaeologists are still uncovering proof of historic, complex Amazonian civilizations. No golden metropolis has been found, but new ruins, earthworks, and settlement grids suggest that the heart of the jungle once beat with life, a ways richer than ever imagined. But El Dorado nevertheless gleams, no longer on the ground, but inside the thoughts, because we never definitely needed evidence. We wanted the pursuit. The idea that somewhere out there is more. That one remaining mystery remains untold. That if we cross a ways enough, try difficult enough, risk enough, we will find the component that adjustments the entirety. El Dorado is no longer a physical region. It's a metaphor for ambition, for obsession, for the human starvation for what lies simply past the horizon. We chase it in careers, in relationships, in dreams, and on occasion in jungles. It would not remember if it's actual. What subjects is that we maintain strolling in the direction of it. Ultimately, El Dorado was never observed. No gilded town, no palace partitions shimmering within the solar, no thrones carved from emerald. The jungle by no means opened its hands. And yet, the legacy of El Dorado outlasted the kingdoms that looked for it. Because what the explorers didn't recognize, what they couldn't realize was that the real treasure was by no means gold. It became what the adventure found out about themselves, approximately civilization, and about the stories we hold too. They located rivers no map had ever proven. They encountered humans with understanding of the forest that rivaled any Eku academy. They recorded languages, vegetation, and customs never earlier than visible by means of the Western global. Some of them, like Francisco de Orellana, unknowingly made records no longer with the aid of coming across El Dorado, but through starting a direction into the coronary heart of the most important rainforest on the planet. Others misplaced everything. Their wealth, their sanity, their lives. And yet they too are a part of the legend. Their names echo via time. No longer for what they found, however for what they were inclined to threat. El Dorado endures as it speaks to something buried deep interior us. The notion that there is usually greater. Greater to discover, more to end up, more simply past the horizon. We see it in every challenge, every impossible dream. The entrepreneur chasing the ideal concept. The artist attempting to find the ideal paintings. The vacationer in search of the untouched nook of the sector. They may be all in their personal manner, following a golden city that may not exist, but still shapes everything they do. The parable isn't always a failure. It is a replicate. It reflects our ambition, our interest, and sure, our greed. It shows how some distance will go for something lovely, something significant, something that whispers to us in the quiet, pronouncing, only a little similarly. El Dorado isn't a lost city. It is a question, and each generation solutions it of their personal manner. So the subsequent time you listen a story too correct to be proper, ask yourself, is it a lie or is it a dream worth chasing? Due to the fact from time to time, the actual El Dorado is the journey itself. The origins of the Olympic Games weren't approximately facts or trophies. They have been approximately reverence. It turned into the 12-month 776 B. CE, deep inside the cradle of ancient Greece. Across the mountains and valleys, people commenced to acquire, now not to combat, no longer to exchange, but to worship. They got here to a sacred area referred to as Olympia, nestled within the lush landscape of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. There has been no city here, only a spiritual sanctuary, shaded with the aid of olive trees and guarded by way of the watchful gaze of gods carved in marble. The cause to honor Zeus, the king of the gods, through ritual, sacrifice, and the physical excellence of mortal guise. The Olympic video games have been born not in a stadium, but at an altar, an historical mound of ash built from generations of burnt services. Before an unmarried race become run, earlier than a discus flew through the air, sacrifices had been made. Oxmen have been led to the altar. Incense became burned. Hymns have been sung. The primary Olympics were at their core an act of devotion. Handiest Greek men were allowed to compete. Handiest unfastened citizens. They came representing their polis. Metropolis states like Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Sparta. Every athlete wasn't just racing for himself. He was racing for his place of birth, sporting its pride on his lower back like a cloak. There had been no stands, no announcers, no worldwide audience. But the air buzzed with something sacred. Olympia became a crossroads where language, politics, and competition paused, if only for a few days, and Greeks remembered that they have been one people beneath the gods. And so from all corners of the Hellenic global, they got here barefoot and bronzed, some taking walks for weeks simply to be part of the instant. Competing wasn't just allowed. It became holy. It changed into a manner of stepping towards the divine, of testing the human shape because the gods intended it to be. Robust, focused, and unashamed. There was no gold, no silver best honor. No empire had demanded this collecting. No king decreed it. The games rose from a deeper vicinity, something woven into the soul of Greek identity. Right here within the shadow of temples, underneath the eyes of Zeus, the Olympic video games took their first breath, not as recreation, but as sacred ritual. In a land often divided by way of rivalries and countless conflict, It became exquisite that every 4 years, the Greeks found a reason to stop preventing. That cause turned into Zeus. Earlier than each Olympic Games started out, heralds had been sent out from Elis, the location that ruled Olympia, to announce the Echeria, the sacred truce. It wasn't an offer. It changed into a solemn, binding agreement. For 1 month, sometimes 3, all battle throughout the Greek world became to end. No armies could march. No soldiers could draw swords. Even opposed borders have been quickly opened, permitting athletes, priests, and spectators to travel freely. The truce failed to mean peace among city-states. It's supposed to appreciate for something better than politics, the gods. In theory, it allowed athletes from anywhere within the Greek international, whether or not allies or bitter enemies, to journey competently to Olympia. In practice, it was a miracle of international relations. City-states that had clashed at the battlefield, one season ought to stand aspect by side at the tomb the following. Even Sparta, with all its martial pride and defiance, located the truce for tons of its early history. To violate the truce changed into to ask divine wrath. People who dared face sanctions, no longer just from other city-states, but from the gods themselves. Zeus was not only a protector of the video games. He became their witness. At Olympia, a large bronze statue of Zeus stood with thunderbolt in hand, a silent reminder that the policies of the gods have been no longer to be damaged. But the truce wasn't most effective approximately protection. It changed into about harmony. Greece became now not a country. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent police, regularly at war with every other. But via the sacred truce, they might acquire together in an unmarried place for a single motive, sure with the aid of a shared reverence. It became more than just political necessity. It was symbolic. The truce taught that even in a world ruled by conflict, there might be moments of order, appreciate, and formality. For a quick time, Greek identification rose above competition. And because the olive wreaths have been prepared and athletes stepped into the arena, it was under the quiet strength of peace. Not one enforced via squaddies, but one commanded by using the gods. At Olympia, there were no uniforms, no tunics, no armor. The athletes of historical Greece competed naked, absolutely, and intentionally. To the cutting-edge thoughts, it might appear stunning, but to the historical Greeks, the unclothed frame became no longer something to hide. It changed into something to have a good time. Energy, symmetry, and discipline weren't just physical developments. They have been reflections of virtue, of the soul made seen. Competing nude wasn't simply allowed. It became expected. It changed into part of the ritual. The Greek phrase gymnos method bear. From it got here health club, the education ground, and later the fitness center. To educate the body changed into to teach the mind. Athletes blanketed themselves in olive oil, now not for conceitedness, however to showcase the shape and reduce chafing in the course of movement. Dirt became frequently sprinkled over the oil to prevent slipping and to accentuate muscle definition. On this sacred placing, the human shape became artwork. And it wasn't pretty much appearance. Competing bear symbolized equality. Inside the area, wealth and social elegance were stripped away, actually. What remained became attempt, subject, and uncooked bodily skill. The body have become the handiest uniform and excellence became the only rank. However, this exposure additionally had an ethical part. For the Greeks, shame turned into now not in nudity, but in cowardice, cheating, or weak spot. To step onto the tune, into the wrestling pit, or earlier than the javelin line without apparel become an announcement. I've not anything to hide. It changed into a gesture of transparency, of boldness. The athlete placed himself before the gods and his humans in complete honesty. Sculptures from this period reflect that reverence. Chiseled statues of runners, discus throwers, and wrestlers, frequently idealized, had been not simply decorations. They were symbols of the heroic spirit, frozen in marble for generations to have a look at and respect. Even the gods themselves, Apollo, Heracles, have been depicted in the identical heroic nudity. Girls of root were excluded, now not most effective from competing, but even from watching. Most effective unmarried ladies were allowed as spectators, and even that was uncommon. The Olympic area became entirely male, sacred, exposed, and competitive. On this surroundings, nudity wasn't indecent. It became divine. The naked athlete stood as a reciting supplying. A frame educated, tested, and converted. Now not for glory on my own, however for the desire of Zeus. In the first Olympic Games, there were no second probabilities. Simplest one man should win. There have been no silver medals, no podium with 3 tiers. The Greeks believed that excellence changed into singular. Victory changed into absolute. And so, in each occasion, only the first area athlete turned into venerated. Crowned with an easy yet sacred praise, a wreath of untamed olive leaves cut from a holy tree close to the temple of Zeus. The olive wreath, called a kotinos, held no economic fee. It wasn't gold, failed to sparkle, and couldn't be traded. But it supposed something more. It became a present from the gods, a reciting image of immortal glory. To win an Olympia intended having your call recorded for all time. It intended returning for your palace as a hero. Your statue is probably erected in the sanctuary. Poets might write verses on your name. Cities every now and then offered their champions lifetime privileges, unfastened meals, theater seats, or public workplace. However, the games were not approximately prizes. They have been about arete, a Greek concept of virtue and excellence. To possess, arete, become to fulfill your motive, to perform at the height of human capability. And for athletes that meant triumphing, not anything less. The competitions had been fierce. Victory turned into now not simply non-public, it changed into political. Each athlete represented his town state. A win at Olympia pondered no longer just his own power, but the energy and honor of his human beings. The consideration belonged to all. That made victory even extra crucial, and defeat even extra sour. There has been no room for excuses, no do-overs. The line among everlasting fame and overall obscurity will be measured in a breath, a stumble, an unmarried moment of hesitation. And for those who failed to win, there were no commemorations, no odds. They again domestic quietly, frequently forgotten by means of history. However the victor, he stood aside, topped in silence, his wreath catching the mild. He became a part of something sacred. The Greeks believed that such men had been touched by means of the divine, that they had now not just outrun their competitors. They had pleased the gods. In an international without medals or sponsorships, this unmarried fragile crown of olive leaves supposed everything. Due to the fact for the Greeks, immortality failed to come from wealth. It got here from being remembered. The very first Olympic video games, held in 776 BC, league, featured only an unmarried occasion, a sprint referred to as the stadium. It changed into a foot race more or less 192 lengthy, the duration of the stadium itself. There were no beginning blocks, no shoes, no fake start consequences, simply bare feet on packed earth. A straight line marked between two posts and silence before the judge's signal. The runners leaned ahead, dust rose, and then they ran. The primary recorded Olympic champion in history became a prepared dinner named Koi Boss of Elise. A humble man whose name might echo for lots of years, clearly due to the fact he ran the fastest once. His prize no longer cash, not energy, only a wreath of olive leaves and an area within the eternal scroll of Olympic victors. Over time, the games grew. By the 7th century BC, new occasions had been delivered. The dolos, a double-length race. The doichos, a protracted distance run. Then came wrestling, discus, javelin, and the lengthy jump. All elements of the brutal pentathlon. An event checking out total physical capability. To win, you needed to be no longer just fast, but sturdy, agile, and smart. One of the most awe-inspiring additions was the pancrean, a deadly mixture of wrestling and boxing with nearly no rules. Whatever changed into allowed, except biting and eye gouging. Guys left the area bloodied and broken. A few even died. However, in case you gained, you had been unstoppable, a reciting legend. After which came the chariot races. Thundering hooves across the hippodrome, dust clouds rising, wheels shattering, horses and drivers tumbling. These races have been dangerous, chaotic, and wildly famous. They weren't pushed through the athletes themselves, however, by using employed charioteers. But the proprietor of the horses, now not the driver, changed into presented the crown. Repute mattered. But in 776 BC, it became simply that first foot race, one occasion, one victor, one starting. And but from that unmarried competition, a movement become born, one which celebrated the bodily form as divine that driven the body past comfort, and transformed sport into something extra than a sport. It became ritual. It became honor. And because the years surpassed and new events had been delivered, the authentic race, the stadium, remained the heartbeat of the games because the whole thing Olympian commenced with an unmarried sprint. The Olympic Games have been now not just competitions. They were ceremonies. Every race, every throw, every moment of exertion opened up beneath the gaze of the gods. In Olympia, game became sacred, and at its coronary heart stood Zeus, ruler of Mount Olympus and the divine patron of the games. Earlier than the contests commenced, a tremendous sacrifice became held at the altar of Zeus. This wasn't symbolic. It became principle. Dozens of oxmen had been slaughtered in honor of the god, their ashes piled high on an altar made completely from the remains of past sacrifices. This mound of sacred ash had grown over centuries, fed via the devotion of athletes and priests alike. To compete in Olympia, athletes needed to swear a solemn oath inside the temple of Zeus. With hands upon a chunk of bow's flesh, they promised to train honestly, to compete fairly, and to convey no shame to the video games. Dishonest become no longer simply dishonorable. It became sacrilege. Folks who broke their oath may be fined, beaten, or completely banned. Their names is probably etched onto statues of Zeus' bronze effigies of Zeus, positioned at the doorway of the stadium as a warning. Right here are the ones who dishonored the gods. Presiding over the video games had been the Hellenodi, judges chosen from the place of Eli's. They weren't mere referees. They had been priestly figures, guardians of each the rules and the rituals. They trained for 10 months before the games, gaining knowledge of now not handiest athletic requirements, but also non-secular protocols. They wore crimson robes and carried staffs, symbols of their sacred authority. And then there was the temple of Zeus itself, certainly one of the biggest and maximum majestic inside the Greek global. Inner stood a statue over 40 toes tall, crafted via the sculptor Phidias, made from ivory and gold. Seated on a throne, protecting a scepter and a determin of Nike, the god watched over the video games with a relaxed, everlasting gaze. It became so incredible it'd later be named one of the 7 wonders of the ancient global. Each jump, every strike, each drop of sweat was a form of worship. At Olympia, the body moved in rhythm with the divine. Victory wasn't just for satisfaction. It turned into for Zeus. In historic Olympia, the air became full of competition, ritual, and the scent of olive oil. But one issue was conspicuously absent. Ladies. The Olympic video games have been an all-male affair, not simplest in competition, but additionally in attendance. Married ladies were strictly forbidden from looking the video games. The penalty, according to legend, become demise, especially being thrown off Mount Tipan. It became a mirrored image of the deeply patriarchal structure of Greek society, where public existence, mainly in athletic and sacred spaces, was the domain of guys. The video games celebrated the suitable male form. Nudity was widespread, and the competitions had been now not just athletic, they were philosophical. The male frame, skilled and disciplined, became visible as a reflection of cosmic order, a dwelling sculpture of virtue. Ladies, mainly married women, had no vicinity on this visual and symbolic environment. Nevertheless, not all ladies have been excluded from the Olympic story. Unmarried ladies had been occasionally allowed to watch, and they had their personal event, the Heron Games, held in honor of Hea, the wife of Zeus. Those video games featured foot races for young ladies held inside the same stadium, however with key variations. The races have been shorter. The ladies ran clothed, wearing quick kittens that left one shoulder naked. Their hair was worn loose, unbound and loose. The victors acquired olive crowns and were allowed to dedicate statues to Hea. But whilst the Heron Games were meaningful, they had been not the Olympics. The Olympic video games remained a sacred male, ritual bound to Zeus and Navy values. Power, persistence, and glory have been cultivated for the battlefield as much because the arena. To be an Olympic victor turned into to be a hero of the polis, a position Greek women had been definitely now not allowed to count on. There may be one curious exception. The case of Kiniska of Sparta, a rich girl who bred horses. Because chariot races awarded the crown to the proprietor, no longer the driver, Kiniska technically became the first girl Olympic champion. However, even she by no means set foot in the stadium to witness her victory. The exclusion of ladies wasn't simply custom. It turned into non-secular law, social code, and cultural identification wrapped into one. In Olympia, the games had been many things, but they were now not for girls. In historic Greece, a victory at Olympia became extra than private triumph. It became political capital. To win was to convey honor not just to oneself, however, to at least one's polis, the house city kingdom. Each athlete stood as a living logo of where he came from. A victory within the Olympic video games meant superiority in strength, field, and divine desire. And that superiority contemplated on the society that raised him. Whilst an Olympic victor back domestic, he turned into welcomed as a hero. Town gates have been opened in his honor. Crowds covered the streets. Songs had been sung. His call might be carved into stone or etched into nearby reminiscence with the aid of poets. One of the maximum well-known became Pindar, who composed elaborate victory odes rich in language and fantasy, commissioned by means of towns to immortalize their champions. However, the birthday celebration did not quit with applause. Victors have been frequently rewarded with items, land, money, free food for life, tax exemptions, or even statues in the public square. In some cities, they were given high seats at the theater or the front rows at political gatherings. They is probably elected to office, now not because of their phrases, however due to their body and what it had demonstrated in Olympia. A few rich elites used the Olympics to elevate their repute. They funded education packages, sponsored athletes, or even bred horses for the chariot races in which the owner, not the driver, claimed the prize. For those aristocrats, an Olympic win turned into like winning an election. It cemented their legacy, elevated their affect, and fashioned how records might keep in mind them. Even rivalries between city-states played out through sport. When Athens and Sparta clashed politically or militarily, additionally they watched every different carefully in the area. Who had greater victors? Who educated tougher? Which policies did the gods seem to choose? Victory become a message. We're the more potent humans. Our way of existence is the better course. In this manner, the Olympic Games have become a stage for international relations, a battlefield of symbolic war where towns competed for glory without drawing blood. The olive wreath may additionally have seemed humble, but within the global of historical Greece, it carried the load of political energy, cultural pleasure, and immortal reminiscence. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games burned bright in ancient Greece. Every 4 years without fail, athletes, poets, clergymen, and spectators made the journey to Olympia, now not for earnings but for glory, devotion, and cohesion. However, not anything in history is eternal. In 393 CA, the Christian Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree that introduced the historical games to uncease. To him, they had been a pagan ritual incompatible with the growing dominance of Christianity inside the Roman International. Temples had been shuttered, altars dismantled, statues defaced. The sacred flame of Zeus become extinguished. The stadium fell silent. Centuries passed. The site of Olympia have become ruins, slowly buried with the aid of time and earth. Nature reclaimed the track. The voices diminished. The names of champions were forgotten besides, via a few scribes who recorded their victories in dusty scrolls. And yet the concept never absolutely died. Inside the 19th century, as archaeologists exposed the bones of Olympia, its columns, temples, and training grounds, hobbies stirred once more. What if the games could go back? Not just as an interest, however as an international symbol. In 1896, the vision became truth. The present-day Olympic Games had been born in Athens, reimagined via Baron Pierre Dubetta, who believed that game could carry countries together in peace, just because it as soon as brought Greeks together at Olympia. He borrowed a number of the antique traditions, the four cycle, the flame, the procession of athletes, even the proper of areta, excellence of body and spirit changed into revived. Nowadays, the Olympic torch is lit in Olympia within the shadow of the ruined temple of Hea, the usage of a parabolic replicate, and the rays of the sun, simply as it might have been in historical days. From there it travels across continents, a flame that connects beyond to provide. And though the cutting-edge video games are global, business, and aggressive on a big scale, their coronary heart nevertheless beats with an historical rhythm, a party of human ability, of peace, of striving for something better than victory on my own. From the sacred soil of Olympia to stadiums round the world, the Olympic spirit keeps, now not as a relic but as a dwelling culture. The sacred fireplace become never certainly extinguished. It turned into exceeded on. The story of the Colossus does not begin with bronze or artistry. It starts off evolved with a siege, and with a town that refused to fall. In 305 BCE, the island of Rhodes located itself underneath siege by way of one of the maximum feared army minds of the Hellenistic world, Demetrius Theas of Macedon, also referred to as the besieger. He arrived within military tens of lots robust, subsidized by warships, catapults, and a notorious siege tower known as the Helpless, a mobile castle 9 taels excessive. Rhodes, by way of contrast, becomes small. A proud naval town, wealthy through change and professional in international relations, but dwarfed via Demetrius's May. His aim was to crush Rhodes for its alliance with Egypt, the rival strength of the Ptolemies. It must have been a short marketing campaign. It wasn't. For nearly a year, the Rhodians held the line. They used their terrain, their walls, and their wits. At night time, they snuck out to burn siege equipment. They reduce off-deliver routes. They tailored faster than Demetrius may want to modify. Even when the huge Helpless rolled in the direction of the town, they found a way to disable it, drenching it with oil and placing it alight. Subsequently, the siege collapsed. Demetrius withdrew, humiliated, leaving at the back of his battle machines and shattered pride. The town changed into spared. Its human beings, although scarred, had been unbroken. And now they desired to make sure no one ever forgot. The Rhodians amassed the stays of the siege. Abandoned towers, damaged catapults, and thousands of kilos of bronze and iron. These could now not go to waste. They could be melted, reforged, and reborn. Not into guns, however, into a monument. To mark their fantastic victory, they chose to honor their customer deity, Helios, god of the solar. They could build him a statue, now not normal, not even grand, but tremendous, something the arena had by no means seen. They commissioned Charis of Lindos, a sculptor recognized for his precision and ambition. He promised not just a statue, but a symbol. Something that could say in no unsure terms, Rhodes stands tall. Rhodes stands unfastened. And so, from the ashes of war, the vision of the Colossus began, no longer as a wonder, but as an act of defiance. With victory nevertheless fresh and pride swelling of their hearts, the humans of Rhodes grew to become their attention to a task not like any the arena had ever seen. They would construct a statue not just to commemorate their resistance, but to send a message across the seas, a message forged in bronze and rooted in stone. They selected to honor Helios, the solar god, whom they believed had included their metropolis throughout the siege. In Rhodes, Helios wasn't a far-off celestial being. He became a dad or mum, a presence woven into the identification of the island. His rays shone on each harbor stone. And now he would take delivery of shape. To deliver that vision to lifestyles, they summoned Charis of Lindos, a native Rhodian and a grasp sculptor. Charis had trained below Leucippos, the famed sculptor of Alexander the Extraordinary. He understood share, symmetry, and ambition. The undertaking earlier than him become huge. The Colossus could stand over 100 toes tall, almost the peak of a modern-day 10-tail building. It'd be made entirely of bronze with an assisting shape of iron and stone. The substances came from the very siege machines Demetrius had left in the back of. Heaps of kilos of bronze from melted-down weapons, and armor would grow to be the skin of the god. What had as soon as threatened Rhodes would now guard it. Construction started around 292 BCE, and it might take 12 years to finish. The process changed into sluggish and planned. The statue turned into probably built from the floor up, with each segment cautiously solid, assembled, and strengthened as the shape rose. People toiled within the blazing solar, shaping metallic, aligning joints, and creating what would come to be one of the 7 wonders of the historical international. We do not know exactly what it gave the impression of. No historic photos live to tell the tale. However, it is believed Helios stood upright, possibly with one hand defensive his eyes as he seemed east, or with an arm raised in triumph, his face calm, his crown a radiant halo of sunbeams. It wasn't just artwork. It wasn't just religion. It changed into identity. Cast from the relics of war, the Colossus of Rhodes turned into more than a statue. It changed into a reminder to all who entered the harbor that this town stood unshaken, and that its mild might now not be dimmed. While the Colossus became eventually finished, sometime round 280 BCE, it turned into not simply a statue. It became a revelation. Standing greater than 30 m tall, the Colossus of Rhodes was the tallest statue of the ancient world. Built absolutely of bronze plates over an inner skeleton of iron and stone. It ruled the skyline of Rhodes and astonished every traveler who sailed into the harbor. Though later myths would claim it straddled the harbor entrance with ships passing among its legs, historians and engineers agree this will have been structurally impossible. As an alternative, the statue maximum probably stood to the aspect of the harbor, perhaps a pinnacle, a stone pedestal, in which it could be seen from afar. Its bronze body glowing within the solar, its crown of radiating spikes echoing the solar god's divine rays. The engineering in the back of it changed into not anything brief of fantastic. Each bronze plate was cautiously fashioned and outfitted, locked right into a hidden framework that saved the large stable. Weights were dispersed calmly. Joints have been concealed. The statue can also have been constructed using earthen ramps, which have been raised regularly as production climbed upward, then removed once the very last segment changed into whole. The figure of Helios in all likelihood stood in a relaxed, upright pose, one hand resting by way of his facet, the opposite raised, perhaps in salute or keeping a torch. His face changed into serene, younger and idealized, as become the Greek inventive lifestyle. His gaze would cast across the ocean, looking over sailors and traders as they entered the harbor of Rhodes. But the Colossus became greater than only a father or mother. He turned into an image to Rhodians. Helios embodied freedom, resilience, and divine prefer. His towering shape announced to the arena that Rhodes had not best survived the siege, but emerged extra. The city had taken the guns of war and grew to become them, right into a monument of peace. Traffic stood in awe. The statue wasn't just tall. It appeared everlasting. The daylight danced throughout his bronze floor. His shadow stretched throughout the harbor walls. And for a moment, standing under him, one ought to nearly accept as true with the gods walked amongst guys. In Helios, Rhodes had built its pride and set it in bronze. For 12 shining years, the Colossus stood no longer just as a statue, but as a sign hearth to the ancient world, announcing a new era for Rhodes. The metropolis, lengthy a crossroads of cultures and commerce, now found itself basking in global admiration. With the bronze shape of Helios rising above its harbor, Rhodes have become a beacon, each literal and symbolic, to traveling traders, envoys, and poets. The Colossus declared that this island changed into extra than a naval stronghold. It turned into a rising cultural pressure. The presence of the statue converted public identity. The Rhodians noticed themselves not merely as survivors of siege, however as selected humans, included with the aid of the sun god, multiplied through victory, destined for greatness. Helios wasn't only a god they worshipped in temples. He turned into now a presence casting his gaze from the skyline. The image of the Colossus soon seemed on Diane cash, minted and traded across the Mediterranean. Helios, topped with rays, have become a mark of Rhodian pride and prosperity. Inscriptions celebrating the Colossus commenced to circulate. Vacationers wrote of the way the sun regarded to mirror off his bronze skin at sunrise, painting the harbor in golden mild. Culturally, Rhodes flourished. The city have become a hub for philosophers, sculptors, and orators. Faculties of rhetoric were based. Statues covered the agora. Art, politics, and faith merged into a sophisticated civic identification, with the Colossus at its center. However, the statues, which means extended past the borders of Rhodes. It stood as a standard logo of resilience in the face of impossible odds. A statue forged from enemy guns, committed to a god of mild, visible to all who sailed the sea. It reminded humans across the Hellenistic world that energy will be sculpted from struggling. That peace, as soon as secured, may be formed into beauty. For some, the Colossus represented divine concord, a metropolis and a deity in perfect alignment. For others, it was evidence that even in an age of conflict and conquest, Something may be built that's stimulated in preference to destroyed. And for the Rohuddians, it become truly theirs, their triumph, their God, their skybound promise. The Colossus wasn't just a surprise. It was desire in bronze. In 226 BCE, simply over a decade after the Colossus changed into finished, the floor under Rhodes started to tremble. Without caution, a large earthquake struck the island. Houses collapsed. Temples cracked open. The harbor partitions shuddered. And then, with a groan of metal and a cry from the heavens, the effective statue of Helios, the pleasure of the metropolis, snapped on the knees and fell. The Colossus did not honestly tip over like a tree. It broke piece via piece, twisting because it descended. The legs crumbled first, and the higher frame slammed into the earth, shattering sections of bronze. Hands the dimensions of men, splintered. The head, as soon as watching out to sea, now lay face down within the dust. Nobody had anticipated it, and no person could stop it. The harm to Rhodes became extreme. However, not anything struck the people greater deeply than the lack of their God's picture. The Colossus had turned out to be extra than a statue. It became an accomplice, a symbol of divine prefer. Now it lay in break. Its wreckage sprawled across the town's sacred ground. And yet, even in ruin, it remained a wonder. For hundreds of years after the quake, vacationers nonetheless came to peer what became left. The historian Strauss wrote of the fallen Colossus, describing the sheer length of its remains. Traffic stood in the shadow of its damaged limbs and marveled on the engineering it had as soon as required. The fingers were thicker than a man's torso, the ribs of bronze curled like forgotten armor. Inside, they saw the iron framework and the wonderful layout of a civilization determined to defy its enemies. Some said the fall became a punishment from the gods. Others believed it became a reminder that even glory should bow to nature. But most Rhodians, though heartbroken, refused to erase it. The Colossus, though damaged, becomes still sacred. They left the pieces in which they fell. And for the next 800 years, those fragments remained. Silent, rusting, widespread, a fallen god, a shattered marvel, but by some means greater human in its brokenness than it had ever been in perfection. The statue had once represented energy. Now it whispered of impermanence, and that too became something sacred. After the dirt of the earthquake settled and the grief diminished into silence, the question rose like morning fog over Rhodes. Must we rebuild it? The fallen Colossus nevertheless lay scattered throughout the ground, its bronze skin gleaming in the sunlight, its damaged limbs stretched like a napping large alongside the earth. Many citizens wanted it restored. It was, in spite of everything, their symbol, their guardian, their pride. But others hesitated. And so, as they generally before, the Rhodians turned to a voice older than their town. The Oracle of Delhi. The oracle's reaction became chilling. The gods had spoken, she said. The autumn of the Colossus turned into no twist of fate. It was a signal. Helios become displeased, and rebuilding the statue would provoke in addition divine wrath. The Rhodians, deeply spiritual and careful now not to offend their consumer deity, took the warning critically. They abandoned the concept. However, there have been additionally practical motives. Rebuilding a statue of such scale could have required big assets, materials, labor, time. The authentic Colossus had taken 12 years to assemble. Its cost had been underwritten by means of the spoils of war and donations from allies. But now the monetary climate changed into distinct. The political landscape became greater volatile. Rhodes confronted new threats and moving alliances. Rebuilding a statue, irrespective of how iconic, failed to seem smart in such uncertain times. And so the decision turned into made. Permit it relaxation. For centuries and a while, the Colossus remained in pieces, but it changed into in no way forgotten. The fragments have become a kind of out-of-doors museum. Pilgrims and poets, buyers and scholars all came to see the ruins. They walked the various statues' large ribs. They positioned hands on its outstretched palms. They marveled at its shattered face. There was awe even in destruction. And possibly it is why Rhodes never lifted it once more. Due to the fact sometimes a fallen wonder speaks louder than a status one. Now and again, damage will become a type of reminiscence, one that humbles, teaches, and lingers longer than glory. The Rhodians failed to rebuild because they failed to need to. The Colossus had already completed its process. It had come to be legend, and legends as soon as born do not need bronze to face. Though the Colossus had fallen, its fame only grew. As centuries exceeded, the damaged statue have become legendary. Now not in spite of its destruction, but because of it. Tourists from across the Mediterranean endured to visit Rhodes, no longer to look a status monument, but to witness a ruined marvel. The Greek historian Strauss, writing nearly centuries later, defined the stays in vivid detail. He talked about bronze fingers longer than a man, whole limbs as huge as towers, and a shattered torso that also held the form of a god. Even in fragments, the Colossus stirred awe. It became a place of reflection, proof that even the best works may want to spoil. What stood earlier than visitors turned into no longer a statue, however a ghost of greatness, mendacity in country below the solar. Not like different wonders of the sector, the Colossus wasn't destroyed by way of battle or hatred. It hadn't been toppled via invaders or melted down in rage. It had been added low via nature, an earthquake, blind and unbiased, reminding humanity of its limits. Nevertheless, the remains have been dealt with reverence. The Rhodians by no means melted them down, never swept them away. They left the ruins wherein they fell, letting time and wind and reminiscence weave them into something sacred. In the historical global, the seven wonders had been now not just lists. They were pilgrimages. And Rhodes, although its statue lay in pieces, became one of those sacred destinations. Along the towering lighthouse of Alexandria and the placing gardens of Babylon, the broken colossus held its location. It changed into one of a kind, greater somber, greater human. Other wonders dazzled with grandeur. The colossus now stimulated something quieter or tinged with depression. It confirmed the passage of time. It whispered of ambition, fragility, and the ordinary beauty of collapse. It taught a truth that perfection could not, that even fallen things may be remembered, that on occasion the pieces left at the back of are greater effective than the entire. So the visitors stored coming. They stood most of the ruins. They traced the edges of bronze with their arms, and that they imagined the day whilst Helios once looked down upon the harbor, radiant and unshaken. The marvel nevertheless existed. It had surely changed shape. For over 8 centuries, the damaged colossus lay in which it fell, weathered by sun and wind, sought after by using pilgrims and poets. Generation after generation stood in its shadow, imagining the towering figure it as soon as have been. After which, much like that, it disappeared. In 654 CE, Rhodes changed into invaded through an army of the Umayyad Caliphate, a rising Islamic energy that swept across the Japanese Mediterranean. The city fell, and with it, the closing visible remnants of the colossus. Consistent with later Byzantine chroniclers, the conquerors saw the statue's vast ruins as a supply of cloth, not memory. The bronze becomes said to have been melted down and bought to a visiting Syrian merchant who transported it away piece by using piece, carted off on the backs of 900 camels. Whether that range turned into exaggerated or now not, the message was clean. The Colossus of Rhodes changed into long gone. No extra fragments, no more limbs or ribs to the touch, no more towering bones of a fallen god. The statue that had once watched over the harbor, that had stood for resistance and identification, now existed only in words. And yet those words have been effective. Writers persevered to file it as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, placing it along monuments that still stood, temples, pyramids, tombs. The Colossus, no matter being physically absent, lived on within the world's collective creativeness. Its picture transformed throughout cultures. Medieval maps confirmed it straddling the harbor, a gate of bronze that ships surpassed under. Renaissance artists painted it as a titan, casting shadows across oceans. It became an image of what as soon as changed into, and what may be once more. The irony is that we realize so little about what it truly gave the look of. There are no surviving blueprints, no surviving sculptures or carvings. The whole thing we agree with approximately. The Colossus comes from the echoes of tourists, the pages of historians, and the creativeness of people who came too past due. But possibly that's what makes it eternal. Due to the fact, the Colossus of Rhodes become never just a statue. It turned into a dream cast in metallic, a vision of what humanity ought to construct while courage, beauty, and reason aligned. And at the same time as its body may be gone, its shadow still stretches throughout time. The Colossus of Rhodes no longer stands. However, its which means has in no way collapsed. Greater than 2,000 years after its fall, it stays etched inside the International's creativeness. Now not as rubble, now not as loss, however as symbol. It became never pretty much top, or engineering or bronze. It changed into about what people noticed after they seemed up at it. Electricity in defiance, splendor in resilience, satisfaction made visible. Constructed from the spoils of conflict, the Colossus started as a statement that roads, although small, couldn't be broken. Its humans became the tools of siege into artwork. What changed into once supposed to break them have become a monument to their endurance, and that concept has outlived the statue itself. Throughout history, echoes of the Colossus have surfaced again and again. While France gifted the Statue of Liberty to the US, it wasn't just a gesture of diplomacy. It became a tribute to the equal best, that a towering parent through the harbor may want to welcome the sector and stand for something more than stone or metallic. In modern times, engineers and artists have proposed rebuilding the Colossus. Some believe a brand new statue with sun panels to honor Helios in a sustainable shape. Others envision a present-day wonder of glass and light soaring above the ocean. None have come to pass. But the truth that we nevertheless dream of rebuilding it says the entirety, due to the fact the Colossus represents greater than its very own history. It represents the sort of monument humanity longs to build, not to kings or conquests, however to opportunity. To the idea that out of devastation, something radiant can upward thrust. To the notion that even when toppled, the spirit of a human being remains. In each shattered empire and each rising town, in every monument built after war, in each torch held aloft at the edge of a harbor, the Colossus still stands. It stands in tailies, in symbols, and in the area between who we are and what we dare to construct. Roads may be quiet now, but inside the minds of folks that remember, a god of bronze still watches the waves. Or even broken, he shines.